We know that governments and central banks around the world have really tried to stimulate their economies, and yet about 2/3 of the world's population in developing economies don't really have the fiscal or the monetary capacity to help their own economies. So how big will this gap be between the richest and poorest countries, and how will that affect their recoveries?
I think that is indeed one of the biggest challenges that we face, is that this is a universal crisis, but it doesn't affect us all equally. And that is the reason why we've been calling from the outset for a consolidated and coordinated international response to help those countries that are not in a position to make the massive stimulus and support packages necessary out of their own resources, that they can respond and prevent their economies from declining even further. This is indeed one of the biggest challenges as we look past the immediate crisis to the recovery, is that in many countries there is just a simple lack of resources to recover quickly, and that the investments that are needed, the sorts of support to country economies that will help the recovery, will simply not be available without this kind of international support.
Will the pandemic just make inequality that's already been rampant, not only in developing economies, but even in advanced economies, just become worse?
It certainly will, because as I said, it doesn't affect us all the same. This crisis has disproportionately hurt people who are in low-skilled and low-wage jobs. Those who have occupations that they cannot do from home, but are supposed to be out there in close proximity to others, they have found their sources of livelihood closed down under their feet, and they have no way of earning an income, and they're falling farther behind. It's the same thing with some countries as well. We have countries that are very heavily dependent on commodities. The demand for their exports has fallen back, so their export revenues and their fiscal revenues have been desperately shrunk, and they are now in an even worse position. Many of them are actually facing a possible debt crisis for lack of resources to service the debt or to support the economy. So it really is a tremendous problem from the inequality perspective. And if the crisis continues for very much longer, we will certainly find that more and more people will fall back into extreme poverty.
And Elliott, I suppose the kind of tragic irony is that in that way, that's why a lot of economists are expecting that developing nations, emerging markets are going to recover quicker because, as you say, people were not taken into lockdown. People were still going to work. They didn't have the luxury of being able to work from home or to have economic activity stop. Is that what you would expect to see in the top line data in terms of how the economic recovery plays out in developing nations versus developed ones?
Actually, no. I think we will find that most of the developing economies depend so heavily on demand that comes from the developed economies that until the developed economies really start the recovery, the developing countries will have very little prospect of doing much better. I think of countries that are heavily dependent on tourism, for example, as a source of GDP, a source of income. Until tourists start reappearing on their shores, there's just really very little that they can do. The same thing with the commodity-dependent economies, as I mentioned a little earlier. Until production picks back up in the bigger economies, the middle-income countries and the high-income countries, the demand for their exports will simply remain weak, and there's nothing that they can do about that in the short term. And so, no, I do think that we see in this crisis the close interlinkages of all of the countries of the world's economy, and we will stand together, we fall together, and we will recover together. And this is why we think that this coordinated international response is in everybody's interest.
How much of that does that go to China? Because these interlinkages between small emerging nations and Beijing's debt aid and Belt and Road and the number of other initiatives that have taken place through Beijing's economic and soft diplomacy are immense, right? So how much is that recovery also tied to a robust recovery of China and its ability to be able to uphold, you know, the debt and financial aid promises that it's made?
Well, I think for any of the larger economies, the Chinese economy is the second largest in the world, the American economy as well, then we have we need not overlook the European economy. Until demand and production in these economies really is resuscitated, global economic performance is going to be subpar. There is no doubt about that. China happens to be a critical cog in the whole machine of international trade and the global supply chains. It is a very important player there. And its recovery will be a part of the recovery of these supply chains, the recovery of global trade. But again, I think it is not only a question of China. China was perhaps the first country that was deeply affected by the crisis, the first one to shut down. It is also one of the earliest to start the reopening process. But again, I do not think that reopening the economy is going to be quite as straightforward as shutting it down was. And so it's going to really require that markets around the world are gradually reopened and that demand picks back up. And all of the major economies will have a role to play in bringing economic performance back to anything like the levels we had before the crisis.
Elliott, to your point, given that we are really risking second wave infections that we've already seen play out in countries like China or South Korea, do your numbers, your new UN report that says that we are going to see the global economy shrinking more than 3%, does that factor in potentially more infections down the line?
Unfortunately, no. This is what we would call a baseline assumption, where we are hoping, as I think we all are, that we are able to reopen the economies around the world in the course of the second quarter of the year, so through June and into July, and that by the third quarter, economic activity is starting to pick back up. Now, of course, if we have a second wave of infections and governments find themselves obliged to shut things back down, then, of course, that is a very optimistic projection, and we are likely to confront a significantly worse outcome for this year. We have to hope it doesn't come to that. We have to do everything we can to minimize the risk of further flare-ups in the infection rates. And certainly we have to all cross our fingers and hope that we get a vaccine as soon as possible, because I think that will be critical in the ability of countries to reopen. That sense of confidence that's lacking right now among consumers, that can really only be reestablished when they're relatively sure that they're not putting their lives at risk.
Exactly. That was going to be my next point. How do you see the recovery actually playing out? Because there's a lack of confidence, right? There's no vaccine. So even if we see demand come back, in what shape? Will it be pent-up demand and people really going out and shopping and bringing back economic activity? Or will it be really cautious and muted?
Well, I think it's going to be cautious from the public health perspective. People are going to be trying to avoid crowded spaces to the extent possible. But let us not forget that this crisis has caused a tremendous hit to people's income. We are projecting that we will have lost globally, by the end of next year, some $8.5 trillion of global output. And that cannot remain without impact on people's consumption. People are going to be focusing first on the essential things. They won't be suddenly running back out, I think, at this stage to catch up on the type of consumption that they missed out on because the stores were closed down. They'll be buying the things that they need first and foremost. And gradually, I think they'll pick back up. But again, a key point here is confidence. They have to be relatively sure that it's okay to spend now, because there's little likelihood of them sort of losing income again in the near future. And until we have a relatively clear sense that we've got the public health crisis under control, that niggling doubt will always be there, and it will impede people's desire to go out and participate.
Elliott, just finally, let me ask you about the labor force post-pandemic, because we have seen this outbreak really disproportionately affect the elderly, who have been a crucial part of the part-time job market as well. What will the labor force look after this pandemic is over?
Well, I think we will see a shift. There will be a shift in the nature of jobs. Because one of the things that has become clear through the reaction to the pandemic is that there is a lot of economic activity that actually can be conducted online. We see people working from home where possible. We see a lot more retail being handled through the internet, with delivery services really exploding, and the online retailing as well doing extremely well. Now, we have also heard, and I saw in your previous segment, that we were talking about changes in the way firms think about how they do their business in the future, that they may need much less office space because so much of their activity can be done online from their workers working from home. And we may very well find that there will be a lot more automation, a lot more use of technology and digital technologies in particular, simply because people realize that this is something that allows them to maintain a certain continuity, business continuity, and it provides them with a buffer, if you will, against any further outbreak of disease, but also against the sorts of uncertainties, if you will, that might plague the recovery going forward. So I think we will see a shift in the nature of work, an acceleration of an already ongoing transformation, but we will also see some changes in the way in which we put the work together and where we carry it out. And hopefully this will not be too disruptive, but it is a transition that I think is not going to be stopped anytime soon.